Hi again, everybody, and welcome back for another episode of Ask the Lawyer. I'm Rob Rosenthal with AskTheLawyers.com. Today we're going to ask the lawyer about brain injuries, and specifically undiagnosed brain injuries, and what can be done about that. My guest is attorney David Klibaner of the Klibaner Law Firm in Denver. David, thank you for taking some time with us today. I appreciate it.
Sure, Jack. Thank you.
What are some of the symptoms, maybe less obvious symptoms, that someone may have an undiagnosed brain injury?
Well, the less obvious ones are things such as, there are a lot. I mean, one can be actual balance, and somebody can be walking generally pretty fine, but find they're just bumping into things and not know what's going on. Another one is light sensitivity. In other words, just being around bright lights. I have a client who just keeps her room pretty dark, and when she's at home, and had no idea that was actually a fairly classic symptom of a brain injury, traumatic brain injury. So balance, noise sensitivity is another one. Just having too many noises in a room with a lot of people talking and having some trouble following that, or just being upset by noise. Another client had a problem just being in one of these kind of video game rooms, I guess it was, and just all the sounds kind of drove her crazy and she couldn't concentrate. Those are just a couple of examples of things that people wouldn't really think about. Another is fatigue, just feeling tired and thinking, well, that's from something else, but it really can be a problem from a brain injury too. Same with sleep disturbance, just waking up a lot at night. Those are just a few of the things that can be indications of a brain injury. Now, I have to say that obviously people can have these problems, and it could be from a lot of pain. Someone can be depressed because they're in a lot of pain. So there can be a number of other factors. So I don't want people going away thinking, oh, I've got these, I must have a brain injury. But on the other hand, there are things that could very well be the result of a traumatic brain injury.
I would assume that since some of those symptoms are so common, that could mean maybe that could lead to a misdiagnosis as much as an undiagnosed, right?
It could, although frankly, that's rare. I think what's much more common is that people have brain injuries. Particularly, we're talking about what's called mild traumatic brain injury, but it's not really mild. It's just a term used in the by psychologists and neuropsychologists. Right. But they're more often what happens is that these are undiagnosed, and people go through these and have these problems and don't realize, sometimes for months, sometimes for years, that in fact they are suffering from a traumatic brain injury. So the real problem is lack of the diagnosis. I think rarely are people overdiagnosed, because if brain injuries are suspected because of some of these symptoms, then they'll go on to the next step. Their doctors should go on to the next step and then do further kinds of testing. And we have much better ones than we ever had in the past to confirm that kind of diagnosis.
I think we all maybe think, okay, if I hit my head, there's some sort of impact, that then, okay, there could be a brain injury. But there can be brain injuries from other causes that do not involve impact. Is that true?
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, many times I see, and attorneys specializing in this area see people who have traumatic brain injuries because of car crashes where there's just a very bad whiplash, where their head is jerked back and forth. And that affects the brain and jostles the brain essentially, and can cause what's called shearing, where the essentially the nerves, and particularly the white matter, which are the transmitters, the wires in the brain, essentially get twisted or torn and damaged, and affects the signals in the brain. And that can happen in fact, commonly happens from a bad whiplash type accident. It can happen from a very bad fall, even if the head itself doesn't hit the ground or is hit. So yes, it's really quite common, unfortunately, to have a brain injury even if you're not hitting your head. In fact, that's sometimes what happens with football players. Right. They're not necessarily hitting their head, but just the crashing of their bodies and their heads jerking back and forth can cause injury to the brain.
Why is it so difficult to diagnose brain injuries, even with you mentioned some of the advanced technologies we have now? Why do so many go undiagnosed, do you think?
Part of the problem is, at least when someone goes, let's say, to an emergency room and gets X-rays done or even MRIs, unless it's a very serious brain injury with actual bleeding in the brain that can be seen on an MRI. Most of those MRIs and those kinds of tests don't pick up anything in the brain because the changes are so small and so microscopic that traditional equipment used doesn't really show that a person has a brain injury. So we don't see anything physically on, let's say, an X-ray or a CT scan or an ordinary MRI.
You mentioned some of the new technologies. For the layman, mention some of these new technologies that the doctors now have.
Essentially, we're dealing with super MRIs. So that they're still using the traditional MRI, which is essentially a magnet and radio waves and looks at tissue, soft tissue, including the brain. And we now have much more powerful ones. There's something called a 3T or 3-tensor MRI, which is basically twice as strong, a much more powerful magnet. And that in and of itself can pick up in much more detailed changes in the brain. So sometimes that can actually show us bleeding or other structural changes in the brain that have taken place. And then there's something, and again, it's a kind of MRI, but something called diffuse tensor imaging, or DTI. And that shows, it's an MRI, but it shows changes in the way water is diffused throughout the brain. And essentially when you have damage to the structure, to the white matter or those wires, those axons in the brain, that can pick that up. That DTI can pick that up, whereas an MRI generally cannot, an ordinary MRI, or even a 3T MRI, unless we go through this extra step and look at the sort of the MRI data a little differently. And those things are much more effective in showing us possible brain injury than really anything we've had in recent years.
Well, that's good news. What would be a takeaway? What would you want people that think or suspect or maybe know that they've suffered from a brain injury, maybe undiagnosed, and maybe more importantly, the caregivers and families of those people, what should they know? What would you want them to take away from this video?
Well, I think one of the main things is you can't get treated, or if you're hurt by somebody who negligently caused an accident, you can't be adequately compensated unless you know you have a brain injury if you do. So the most important thing first is to try to get good care, and that would be seeing a good neurologist and discuss the kinds of symptoms that we've talked about.
Right.
I would also go online, either my website or any good attorney specializing, frankly, in brain injuries. And there are sites on brain injuries that list these kinds of symptoms we've talked about. And I would say, don't freak out. Don't think, oh, I have a brain injury. But if you are meeting those symptoms or something that have been plaguing you for a while, excuse me, try to get that medical care. And if it's the type of thing that involves somebody breaking safety rules, let's say a drunk driver or someone else negligently causing harm, then see an attorney who really knows about this area, and he or she can help that person and even help guide that person to the proper diagnostic test to confirm whether or not there is a brain injury involved.
That's great information, David. I think you've probably helped a lot of people today. I appreciate it.
I hope so. Thank you.
That's going to do it for this episode of Ask the Lawyer. My guest has been David Klibaner of the Klibaner Law Firm in Denver. Please take a second, subscribe to our YouTube channel by clicking on the button at the bottom of the screen. And if you want the best information about brain injuries, or you're ready to choose a lawyer that lawyers choose, be sure to visit AskTheLawyers.com. I'm Rob Rosenthal for AskTheLawyers.com.